All right, so topic today, kind of the whole topic this month is we're talking about getting jacked, right? We're going to talk about hypertrophy, and we're going to talk about it in particular from an athlete point of view, because I think that with most topics, like you can make hypertrophy as complicated as you want to make it. You can just go dive into that literature, and you're going to realize that it becomes a soup of complication very quickly. This talk is not that, right? And we're going to kind of let's hit like what the main goal of today is, right? So who is this for? This is not for you if your goal is to step on stage and compete in the sport of bodybuilding, right? So this is Dorian Yates, one of the best bodybuilders in the history of the sport. The things you must do to become Dorian Yates, besides some pharmaceutical aid, is going to be kind of outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today, right? Like I'm vastly more interested in kind of like this realm, right? So I'm talking about just building kind of like these jacked athletes, like with a really key word there being athlete. Like how do we bring hypertrophy to the table for athletes while still making sure that they are athletic, they're strong, they can jump, sprint, cut, and do these things? Because that's a very different conversation of how do I just build a generalized jack athlete versus how do I build and make somebody ready to go step on stage to compete in bodybuilding, okay? So this conversation is going to be about this slide here. Like we're talking about building a jacked athlete, which is going to be significantly different than this conversation, okay? Or this conversation is just going to need to be far more in depth than what we're going to get into, okay? So the theme for today is going to be to keep it simple, stupid, right? I think that in our field here in strength conditioning, people like to dress up pigs and put lipstick on them a lot. We kind of know what works in a lot of different avenues. Like we have protocols, we have things that have worked ever since back in the Eastern Bloc, what Russia and those guys were doing, right? We're really just kind of repackaging in them and then trying to put marketing and sales techniques on them. So I think what we need to do a lot of times is kind of take a look to the past and focus on what do we know works, like what gets the outcome we're chasing, and then keep it really simple and focus on those things, okay? Because here's an example. This is not what we're going to talk about today. So this is mTOR. This is an mTOR pathway. Nobody understands how mTOR works because it connects to everything. It is such a complicated metabolic soup in the cell that when you start kind of like really drilling down at this level, you're going to get totally lost. So I want to focus on like what are the inputs that get me the outcomes. It's going to lead in here, right? So this gets into the black box concept. So what do we know? We know this is going to be kind of a bastardized, really simple example, right? If I lift weights, we have enough evidence over time, empirical evidence. If I lift weights, I eventually get bigger muscles, assuming I eat enough food, right? But where people can get lost sometimes is in the middle, right? It's like I lift weights, something happens in this black box, something is going on underneath the hood of human physiology, which then results in bigger muscles. So the black box is where research lives. That's academia. That's drilling down and trying to actually understand the mechanisms at play. What I want to focus on today is more of like, what are the things that are not happening in the black box? What are the things over on the left? Like, what are the inputs I need to give the system that are going to result in me getting bigger muscles? And then you can kind of drill down as far as you want to go into the black box to try to figure out, like, what does that world look like? Well, like AMPK, mTOR, these different pathways and the cell signaling that goes on there, right? Because a lot of stuff going on in academia and in research is about trying to drill down and find a druggable target, okay? Which is not something I'm overly interested in doing. So I'm going to make this as actionable as possible today and give you hopefully something that you can take and use. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. So we are going to touch on kind of mechanical tension and metabolic stress. So these are the two big variables. These are the two big pieces that we know we have to control from a programming standpoint in order to get hypertrophy. The suck factor, right? So this is a big one. Are you working hard enough to drive the system, to tell the system we need to put on more muscle? Because if you think about it just from a pure evolutionary standpoint, right? Like putting on more muscle is not really advantageous because I have to supply fuel to that muscle. So it makes it harder for me to survive as an organism, right? So you're fighting this battle of trying to put muscle into a system that doesn't necessarily want to carry extra muscle. Okay, so you've got to work pretty hard to accomplish that. We also have volume accumulation. So this is big, right? So we talk a lot about intensity accumulation when we're running strength blocks, but volume accumulation is probably the game and the number one predictor of muscle hypertrophy over time when we're talking about programs and programming for different athletes. And then obviously, like, are you eating enough food to support these other three things. Like if I was going to drill down and try to make hypertrophy as simple as possible, just like 4 variables, this is what it would come out to, right? So if we want to actually put this into an equation, I'm thinking hypertrophy is going to be mechanical tension, metabolic stress, does it suck, volume accumulation, and food. This is, for our intended purposes, the equation we can use, and this can work really, really well to a certain level, okay? And once you cross that level, that's when we start getting into the realm of like pretty advanced bodybuilders. So let's start with mechanical tension, okay? So mechanical tension is produced by force and stretch, right? Hopefully that's not kind of like new or mind-blowing. Our proxy for this is going to be kind of like load and range of motion. If I put more load on the bar, I'm going to have more mechanical tension, right? And so let's assume that range of motion is not going to be a concern here. Let's assume that you can perform it, right? Like I'm not doing like quarter rep bench presses, quarter rep squats. I'm not doing chest flies, like, and not actually like moving my arms apart, okay? Assuming range of motion is there, our proxy for mechanical tension is going to be load. More load is going to be more mechanical tension, right? So there, this is about load. Things usually come back to load in one way or another. Metabolic stress can be a little bit more complicated or hard to think about, okay? So metabolic stress is all about metabolite accumulation from training, okay? So this here is carbonic acid, a beautiful example, right? So as I train, as I work out, right, carbon dioxide is going to be produced. You go look at the citric acid cycle, you can see where the CO2 is coming from, right? So carbonic acid is formed when CO2 reacts with water, which is what we get here. This is a strong acid. It's going to fall apart in solution, and I'm going to start getting pH changes. Another thing in that realm, this is lactic acid. Lactic acid does form. It exists. It's real. It's just such a strong acid that as soon as it's formed, it falls apart in solution. And I start getting these really crazy pH changes, okay? And those pH changes are a big part of this metabolic stress that we've been talking about, right? And then other really good examples of kind of this metabolic stress, metabolic signaling type stuff that you see is going to be, right, these free radicals, these kind of like redox chemistry changes, superoxide, hydroxyl. The real big one here is hydrogen peroxide, because that is like pretty stable in solution. It can actually really impact cell signaling in a pretty major way. So when you think metabolic stress, we're just thinking like, what are the things, what are the byproducts of what's being made while you're training, right? And just go look at metabolism, you can see what's being produced, right? And when you train, when I have muscle contractions, right, if you're anywhere over like a 30% of your contraction, you tend to kind of like block fresh blood from showing up, and you kind of block, you know, old blood from going away. So these things build up. Like the perfect example of metabolic stress is blood flow restriction training, right? If I put a clamp on, I don't allow new blood in, I don't allow old blood out. These things like really build up, right? So that's why BFR works the way it does, right? So our proxy for metabolic stress is going to be reps. Again, coming back to load, right? Because load is going to inherently limit reps for us, and rest, okay? If I decrease rest time, right, I'm going to be shifting things in the direction of metabolic stress. If I increase reps with a lower load, I'm shifting things in the direction of a metabolic stressor, okay? This graphic right here is really important. So this is how I think about, I like to try to put things on spectrums. So on one side of the spectrum, I have metabolic stress. On the other side of the spectrum, I have mechanical tension. These are kind of the two big levers I'm thinking about managing, controlling, moving up and down when I'm writing a program for athletes, okay? On the metabolic stress side of the spectrum, what do we know? Load is going to be lower, reps will be higher, rest is going to be shorter. On the mechanical tension side of the world, my load is going to be higher, reps will be lower, rest will be longer, okay? I want to try to kind of like unpack this a little bit more, right? So if we put this on a bell curve, I like bell curves because bell curves gives us an idea of kind of where the average falls. Where do I want to spend the majority of my time? Because that's where the biggest area under the curve is, okay? So I have 3 reps on one side, I have 20 reps on the other, right? So if we fill this in, and I think this graphic is really kind of like the bread and butter of the presentation today, right? Like, I think this gives you pretty much everything that you need to be successful when you start thinking about programming for hypertrophy to get more jacked with athletes in particular, okay? Because if we break this down, right, so it's just taking that spectrum and kind of providing finer, more granular detail to it. So if I want to dial mechanical tension up to the max, right, like I'm thinking things maybe around 3 to 5 reps. It's going to be really high load, and I'm going to rest potentially as long as 3 minutes, right? Or I can go to the far opposite end of the spectrum, and I can say, you know, I'm going to take things out to about 20 reps, because we know that anything between 3 to 20 reps can probably get the job done. But if I'm at 20 reps, the load is going to be really low. So my rest has to be really short, because what I'm trying to do is trying to build up as much of those, metabolic byproducts as possible, like I just mentioned. But where's your bread and butter? Like, what is the largest area under the curve? Your largest area under the curve is here in the middle, right? 6 to 15 reps with a moderate load, resting 60 to 120 seconds. So the majority of what you're going to do is going to fall in that realm, right? And then you can kind of go out to the extremes as needed, also kind of depending on how you're, one, laying out a training session, and two, the other thing to consider here is like, where do movements inherently make sense, right? Like, does a rear delt fly make sense on the far end of mechanical tension? No, right? Like 3 reps of a rear delt fly is dumb, right? So as the number of muscles involved, as the muscle mass involved decreases, right, you're inherently going to kind of be more of a metabolic stress driven adaptation. Whereas if I start increasing the number of muscles involved, doing things like a deadlift or a front squat, right, like we're going to be able to shift things more towards the mechanical tension side of this story. This is a really good graphic from Greg Nuckols and the guys over at Stronger by Science, because on the top here, you see what people think. And I think he really hits the nail on the head with this, right? Like, people think there's this like really clean distinction of like, well, pure strength is 1 to 5 reps, and strength and size is 6 to 8, and pure size is 8 to 12, right? But when you actually look at how the blue looks of what actually happens, it's kind of this like smortion, if you will, of like, you got blue everywhere. So a lot of different things can work. You have a large range with which you can play. So part of it is kind of experimenting and figuring out like, how do you respond? How does your athlete respond? And again, right, like, just go back to this graphic. This is the realm. These are your tools. This is what you have to play with. So experiment up and down this spectrum, use different protocols and modalities, and notice what's working and what's not working. Okay, the next big lever, the next big variable we have to discuss is, does it suck, right? So our proxy for suck is going to be RPE, right? And in particular, the question you have to ask is, am I at an 8 RPE? Because an 8 RPE tends to be kind of like that threshold that we need to be at in order to drive the change in adaptation that we're seeking, okay? So another really good graphic here, I think this is, who is this from? I think this may be from Stronger by Science guys as well. But just a basic RPE scale if you haven't seen one, right? So if you're at a 10, like, I got no more in the tank, like, you're totally maxed out. A 9.5 would be like, I can't do more reps, but I could probably add more weight. And then the variable of interest, what we're looking for is this RPE of an 8, right? I could do about 2 more repetitions. That's what we're trying to get to, right? And maybe even like a 7 to get the job done. If you have 2 to 3 reps in the tank, right, then we're probably right where we need to be. And if you can be there consistently, we're going to see some success, okay? The question on RPE a lot is like, how do I dial this in, right? Because like, even myself, like, I've trained for a pretty long time. There are times that I feel like my RPE is not actually dialed in. And you're probably going to come back to that with your athletes or your clients over time. You're going to say, okay, like, or yourself, right? It's like, how can I help get this RPE dialed in? Well, my favorite way to accomplish this is to use an AMRAP set every 3 to 4 weeks. So what does that look like? So maybe like week 1 on an intro week to a new block of training, you have a 2x12 on like an accessory movement, say a dumbbell bench, right? So you do 2x12 week 1, 3x12 week 2, 3x10 week 3, okay? Now the entire time, my instruction to you as an athlete is, okay, I need you at a 7 or an 8 RPE, preferably an 8, right? So that should mean that on week 1, you could do this 14 times. On week 2, you could do it 14 times. On week 3, you could do it 12 times. Then on week 4, what I really like to do is say, okay, you're going to hit a 2x10, and then your last set you're going to take for max reps. And what generally happens here is that the athlete will take this max rep set for like 23 reps, like something absurd, okay? So then that's a nice eye-opening experience for the athlete and for me as a coach to know, like, okay, the athlete thought they were at a 7 or 8 RPE, but they really had about 15 reps in the tank the entire time that we were doing this, right? So I know that we're not at the intensity threshold that I want to be at in order to really get hypertrophy on the table for this individual, right? But the athlete does have to learn that with time. And the only way to do that is kind of give them these test sets so they can see, oh, I had way more in the tank than I thought I did. I was at more like a 5 or 6 RPE, because then they feel what a true 10 feels like. Another really good example, another good option here to help dial in RPE is a double progression method. This is something I got from Ryan LeCure. So the way it works is, gotta go back here. The way it works is you just have a set set and rep scheme. So it's 3 sets of 12 to 15 reps. I've also done it doing 3 sets of 10 to 12 reps. Okay. And the way that this works is you work within the rep range, but once you hit the top of the rep range across the board, you must increase weight the following week. So an example would be, okay, on week 1, like maybe I hit 3 sets, and maybe I hit 15 on my first set, I hit 14 on my second set, and I hit 13 on my last set, right? So I didn't hit 15 across the board, so I'm going to use the same weight the following week. Maybe the following week I go 15, 15, 14. Okay, I'm going to use the same weight again. Next week you hit 15, 15, 15. Now your weight has to go up the following week, and the progression starts all over. I really like this because it turns into a fun competition. It gets the athlete competing against himself or herself every single day. And it's pretty impressive to see like how much progress can be made when they're always chasing and fighting for those 15 reps. All right, volume accumulation. Okay, so the number one predictor of muscular hypertrophy. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Yeah, so number one predictor of muscular hypertrophy over time is, oh, I got stuff like popping all over my computer here. Give me a second here. Number one predictor of muscular hypertrophy is volume accumulation, and it should increase over a given periodized cycle. Okay, so if I'm thinking about volume accumulation, what it looks like is sets times reps times load equals volume, something a lot of you have probably seen, okay? But the key to come back to here, like if you're doing a hypertrophy program versus a strength-based program, in the hypertrophy program, I want to see volume accumulation. So the volume number should increase over time. A strength program is more of an intensity accumulation. So volume is going to be going down over time. So let's look at an example. So week 1, maybe you hit 3 sets of 10 at 315, which gives me 9,450 pounds of volume. Week 2, maybe you do 3 sets of 10 at 320. Now I'm at 9,600 pounds of volume. Week 3, I hit 4 sets of 8 at 320. Now I'm at 10,240 pounds of volume. Week 4, I hit another 5-pound jump. Now I'm at 10,400 pounds of volume. So this is an example of volume accumulation, right? You can see that my volume is increasing from week to week as I progress through the program. And so if you really want to focus on hypertrophy and putting on a little bit of size, this is kind of what you're chasing and what you're trying to accomplish in training. Lastly, we get to eat our food, okay? So I'm going to keep this super simple. I don't think nutrition needs to be that complicated, especially when we're just talking about like calories, right? So step 1, calculate total calories using a Harris-Benedict calculator. You can literally just go onto Google, type in Harris-Benedict calculator, and you're going to get those options pulled up. You just plug in your info. It's going to tell you your total calories. Okay. For your lift days, you're going to use the very active option because it's going to give you a couple of numbers that you can plug in based off your activity level. As a baseline start for lift days, say you're very active. For off days, say that you are lightly active. Okay. This is going to give us a really good idea of what your total calorie intake should be just as a baseline. Okay. Because like this stuff with nutrition is kind of, it's a guessing game anyways, right? Like you need some place to start, and then you start to weigh yourself every single week, and then you can make the adjustments week over week as you get going. In terms of macros though, for step 2, really simple. Protein, you're going to set at 1 gram per pound body weight. Fat, you will set at 0.4 to 0.7 grams per pound body weight. For me, I usually put my higher fat content on my lightly active days or my off days. So that's the 0.7. And on training days, I set it lower at 0.4. And I do that because I want to be able to bump up my carbs higher when I train, right? So carbs, you're going to eat as much as you can handle. So if you're familiar with Dr. Ben House's work and the blood sugar stuff, right, you can pretty much throw down as many carbs as you can as long as your blood sugar stays even. Or the easiest thing to do, you know how many total calories you're allotted, right? So just do the calculation. You're going to give yourself 1 gram per pound protein. Say you give yourself 0.4 gram per pound fat. Just fill in whatever's left over with carbs. And then start weighing yourself every week, right? Your goal is going to be to put on something along the lines of like maybe 0.5 pound a week. So make sure that you do it week over week, and you're trying to see what your trend line looks like. If you're trending up, don't touch a thing. If you're flat for a couple of weeks in a row, we need to make an adjustment. We need to bump carbs. We need to bump total calories. Something needs to change, right? But this at least gives you a really good starting place in terms of figuring out, are you eating enough food to put on any form of muscle? Step 3, which we just talked about, weigh and adjust. Shooting for something like 0.5 pound a week would be really good, right? If you're not seeing that over time, make some changes. I would also recommend getting a picture on the same day of every week, because a lot of times like a month, 2 months can go by and you see yourself in the mirror every single day, but you're not going to see the small changes that take place. So being able to have like a before picture from 3 months ago to compare to now, you can actually see the changes take place. So it's another thing I recommend doing in addition to weighing yourself. Right, so we're back to the overview here. So we've hit kind of all the big stuff, right? We hit mechanical tension and we hit metabolic stress. Those should be pretty clear. We touch on the suck factor, right? You need to be at least an 8 RPE, right? Maybe a 7. Volume accumulation over time. If I look at your training and programming, I look at how many sets, how many reps, and how much weight you're using, and I calculate that out, I should see your volume increasing week over week. And then lastly, are you eating enough food, right? Super simple process. Harris-Benedict calculator, get your total number, protein 1 gram per pound, fat 0.4 to 0.7 grams per pound, carbs filled in as needed, then start weighing and making adjustments over time, okay? That is more or less what I had set up for y'all today. So if you have any questions, I'll kind of go in here and unmute you. That's gonna let me unmute you. But if you have any questions, you can type them into chat or just ask them out loud and we will see what we can get going here. Is that pretty clear to everybody? Are there any questions floating around?
That was really straightforward. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Good. No, I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, I mean, it's not meant to be like overly complicated and in the weeds, but like hopefully the goal of this is to give you something super actionable and easy to use when you sit down and start thinking about trying to bring hypertrophy to the table for yourself or for your athletes.
Yeah, I agree absolutely, and like hearing your take on it would, you know, like kind of useful for sharing this information with the clients. You know, getting them to understand what we're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if you can get across, just like sometimes people get too obsessed with trying to add too much weight on the bar. It's like just adding 2.5 pounds is a win. Like that's a PR. Like your volume went up. Like, so don't complain that you're not seeing these huge jumps. Like as long as you're progressing in some fashion week to week, you're going to be good. Smaj, you got anything?
James, I totally agree. I think it was super straightforward. Something I was thinking about as you were going through was, I mean, keep it simple, right? Like you have these clients who tend to want the complexity piece. And it's like, ooh, we're doing hypertrophy. Can I stand on one leg? I think Pat wrote the post today, right? Like I want to do walking lunges supersetted with bicep curls and handstand holds so that I can hypertrophy my lengthened yoga muscles. How are you, I guess, how are you like switching the value of like the complexity piece? And granted, there's some complexity that's going to be good. How are you moving that client from complexity to this place of like, well, we're going to keep things fairly simple and just progress volume? Or are you throwing in a little complexity in there as well in a reasonable manner?
Yeah, it kind of depends like what the client wants, because right at the end of the day, they need to walk out feeling happy, knowing they had a good session.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first one, right? So, and especially like, I think like, not stereotype, right? But women tend to be a little bit harder to sell on this because they don't want to quote unquote get too big, even though like we know that's not really going to take place. So I think a lot of it's just like how you frame it. And maybe like depending on how many times a week you're seeing the client, maybe one day is more of like you're just like throwing them an egg and you're doing a lot of the stuff you know that they really like. And then on 1 or 2 other days, like you're focusing on this thing that you know is probably more important. And so you can get a blend of both, right? So a lot of times if I have just like a gen pop person, it's like I'll have a day where my focus is going to be more just kind of like volume accumulation and reps. I have a day that's going to be a little bit slower, focused on strength, and I have a day that's going to be a little bit more kind of like conditioning, metabolism oriented, right? So we kind of get a little bit of everything. But yeah, like if I'm getting pushback on it, I'll usually just try to figure out, okay, like where do I need to give you more of what you want, or how can I shift some days around potentially? Or maybe it just needs to be like a conversation about, hey, like this is what we're going to focus on right now, and here's why. And you kind of like detail what you're trying to accomplish. And I find like most people, when they understand the goal, they tend to get on board with it.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah. Dope. Beautiful. Kyle, do you have anything? I know you're kind of hanging in there too.
Where are you at in your own training, James?
Where am I at in my own training? So I'm doing I jumped into that Apex training team that I started up. So I'm doing the stack team, which is kind of like the 3-3 split, be as well rounded across the board as possible. So we are wrapping up kind of like our first 4-week phase of training. So next week we're essentially just doing like an EDM style. So it's like an estimated daily max using 8 reps right now. So we're going to kind of wave it down over time. We'll do a little intensity accumulation. So next week, I have to take the best weight I've achieved so far for 8 reps and take it for as many as I can. So I'm really looking forward to that disaster show starting on Monday.
Awesome. That sounds like hell.
But yeah, I'll call you and I'll live stream it for you so you can just watch me get murdered.
Please. When I started over at Top Strength, Steve at the same time posted out this challenge of 405 deadlift for max reps. And I'm like, crap, like coming from the strongman background, like I would feel horrible if I got anything under 15. Like, and I know that I'm far from like a space of like lifting like that right now, but that's where I'm at. Like I'm showing up in the mornings and I'm touching 405 on a regular basis and seeing how far it goes.
Hey, yeah, just gotta do what you can do. Dope. Anybody, anything else? If not, we can.
Yeah.
There we go. Kyle, what's up? Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, buddy. Yeah. I am always a struggle with like the progressive overload crowd versus, like the volume crowd, say like Dante Trudell or Paul Carter versus Mike Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So like adding in sets versus just trying to increase load, basically in some sort of certain reps range. I always just struggle because it's like I could sit all day and do whatever amount of reps at some certain weight, but it's way harder trying to progress on weight and keep the volume the same. You know what I mean? Like, are you basing that off of like RPE? Like you still got to be in close enough to failure to make that volume work for you?
Yeah. So I think like both examples can work, right? And if you lift long enough, you're going to know when you've kind of tapped out your put weight on the bar strategy. So when you kind of tap out your put weight on the bar strategy, like that should be your giant red flag of we need to make a change. I need to add a set or I need to potentially drop reps. Like that's when I start changing like set and rep structure potentially is when I know like, okay, like we can't put more weight on the bar, right? Like this is not an option further. So what are the other variables that I can control and move so that we can still get this progression, right? And so like another one that I didn't talk about are tempos, right? Like tempos are another really good option in terms of like changing kind of like the feel of a movement because we're kind of like dialing up time under tension, which is really going to be more of a metabolic stressor for us, right? So if you are stuck at 3x10 at a certain weight, right? Like another potential progression that you could use is to do it at a slower tempo.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But that won't be the first place I go. I'll usually start playing with sets and reps more to see, okay, like how can we get more out of this?
Yeah. Okay. But you're kind of like, I mean, it made sense. Like you kind of hit your max as far as weight's going to go. And it's just not going to go anywhere, at least nothing worthwhile for a period of time.
Yeah.
And then you could start playing with volume. Like there's just, some rhyme or reason. Cause people just kind of argue about like adding volume versus adding weight. I'm like, I always went to the gym trying to add some weight in some way. You know what I mean? Like I'm not there to just do sets.
Exactly. Both strategies work.
That's so boring to me. And I train for I always trained as a bodybuilder, but it was always still progressive overload just for a certain amount.
Yeah. Right. Like progressive overload works until it doesn't, and like another option there too, like it just may be time to change exercises potentially, right? Like if you've done a lot of stuff with sets and reps, if you feel like you've tapped out load, just like change the variation of the movement, right? Like maybe I'm going to go from a front squat to an SSB squat. And now I have an opportunity to kind of start the progression over, but I know I'm still getting the stimulus I want. So you have like a bunch of levers that you can pull there that are on your side.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Awesome. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I will stop the recording here. And then I'm going to upload this to the website so that people can go back and watch the recording. Have a good, what day is it? Thursday. Have a good Thursday night. Thanks for dropping in. I'm going to try to do these every month kind of moving forward. This is an opportunity to chat about training stuff. Yeah, thanks for stopping by, guys, and that'll do it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks, Shane.
absolutely.